Stevie Ray Vaughan is one of the most legendary guitarists of all time, and deservedly so. The thing is, over the years, his strings have gotten almost as legendary as he is. The funny thing is, Stevie Ray Vaughan didn't actually play just one set of strings. He actually played as light as 12s and as heavy as 17s at one point. But for most of his career, Stevie Ray Vaughan's main guitars, his number 1 and Lenny, that are super legendary, were strung up with 13s, which is probably what you've heard of when you've heard about Stevie Ray Vaughan's guitar strings in the past. What you may not have heard of is that Stevie Ray Vaughan's 13s weren't your normal 13s. So if you go to a guitar store and ask for a set of 13s for electric guitar, the chances are the gauges inside that set are going to look a lot like a set of 13s for acoustic. Most likely they're going to go something like 13, 17, 26 wound for the 3rd string, 36, 46, and 56. Side note, Stevie Ray Vaughan was hardly the only famous guitarist to use a custom set of strings. Everyone from Jimi Hendrix to David Gilmour, Billy Gibbons, Tony Iommi, and many, many more have used very, very customized gauge sets of strings in order to dial in their setup for exactly how they play the guitar. So let's talk about Stevie's set of 13s, because it was a lot different than that set of strings we talked about earlier. In order, his strings went from lightest to heaviest: 13, 15, 19 plain, so he's not using a wound 3rd, and then 28, 38, and 58 on the wound strings. That's way different than the set we talked about earlier. Most notably, the 2nd string through the 5th string in the set, at each of those positions he's using a way lighter string than you would typically see in a set of 13s. We have a 15 instead of a 17, 19 plain instead of a 26 wound, a 28 instead of a 36, and a 38 instead of a 46. So what does that do for him? It gives him a lot more flexibility on those old recordings, and you can hear it. He bends like crazy, and make no mistake, a 15 and a 19 are still a pretty heavy strings to bend, but they're not nearly the same as bending a 17 or a 26 wound. In addition to that, on the very bottom of the set, he uses a 58 instead of a typical 56, which is interesting because he has way lighter strings on the other wound strings. So he has just a massive low E, which works really well for blues playing, where you're often starting with that low E and then doing a riff up on top of it. So in Stevie's set, the only gauge of string that's the same as a typical set of 13s is actually the 13 itself. Every other gauge of string is optimized one way or the other, whether it's less tension or more tension, to better suit what his needs were at that particular position of the guitar. So in fairness, I should also mention that Stevie wasn't playing in standard tuning. He was actually playing in E flat, down a half step across the board. This gives him a little bit more flexibility out of the same gauges of string than you would see in standard. Make no mistake, these are still pretty heavy strings and not super easy to bend for any regular player, but it does help a little bit. The last thing we should talk about with Stevie's strings is that he was actually playing with higher action than a lot of players typically do, which I think is interesting because a lot of lead players seem to like to play with as low of action as humanly possible, where Stevie, who's a really, really great lead player, really liked his action pretty high. This gives him a pretty clean, bell-like tone, no matter where on the guitar's neck he's fretting a note. It really, really sings out and really rings, and it also complements those really thick diameters of strings. As you can imagine, those take up a little bit more space from where they're strung up, and this way they're not really interacting with the frets or getting any buzz or anything like that. As with any discussion of string gauge, it's worth taking these things with a little bit of a grain of salt, because the truth is, while Stevie Ray Vaughan had monster heavy tone, there were also a lot of guitarists that played 8s or 9s or 10s that had really, really heavy meaty tone as well. B.B. King, Jimmy Page, these guys played 8s, and no one's saying that their tone isn't muscular and huge. But if you do want bigger, fuller sound, heavier string gauges can get you a lot of the way there, and it might be something worth trying in your own rig. So what do you think? Are you going to jump straight up to a set of 13s like Stevie, or maybe just go with a set of 11s or even 12s? Let us know down in the comments. If you like this video, give it a like and be sure to subscribe to our channel to keep up with more great stuff just like this.